The first thing I noticed was not the sign. It was the coffee. A fresh pot was sitting inside a building that I had legally owned for less than a week. That might sound like a small detail, but when you buy a property in the middle of the Idaho mountains, drive 3 hours to see it, and find strangers having a meeting inside your lobby, small details become the things you remember forever. I had bought the Forest Lodge on a Tuesday. By Sunday morning, the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association was acting like they had owned it for years. The funny thing is, when I first saw the listing, I wasn't looking for a business opportunity. I wasn't trying to start some big mountain retreat or make money from tourists. I was looking for a piece of my past. My father spent most of his life working for the Forest Service. We never had expensive vacations or fancy family trips. What we had were weekends in the mountains. Every fall, he would load up his old pickup truck, throw a cooler in the back, and drive me to that little lodge hidden between the trees. I still remember the smell of the fireplace, the sound of the creek behind the building, and the way my dad would sit on the porch after dinner with a cup of coffee in his hand. He wasn't a man who talked a lot, but every once in a while he would look out at the mountains and say, "Places remember people, even when people forget places." I didn't understand what he meant when I was younger. I do now. Years passed after my father died. Life got busy. I moved for work. I bought a house. I did what everyone does. I told myself I would visit someday. Someday is a dangerous word. It sounds like a plan, but most of the time it is just a way of delaying something important. Then one night, while looking through county auction listings, I saw the Forest Lodge. The pictures were not impressive. The roof needed work. The paint was faded. The property had clearly been ignored for years. Most people saw an old building with problems. I saw the porch where my father and I used to sit. I saw the trail where we used to walk. I saw the last place where I still felt like I was a kid. So I made an offer. The inspection report was honest. The inspector looked at me and said, "You know this place needs a lot of work, right?" I smiled. "Yeah, I know." He looked confused. Most people hear that and walk away. I looked through the window toward the empty lobby. Most people aren't buying what I'm buying. Closing was simple. Almost too simple. The title company confirmed the records. The county transferred ownership. The deed was recorded. The keys were handed to me. I remember the woman at the title office smiling when she said, "Congratulations. The lodge is yours." I joked, "So nobody can show up next week and tell me it belongs to someone else, right?" She laughed. "If they do, call me." At the time, it was just a joke. For days later, I wished I had taken it more seriously. When I pulled into the lodge parking lot that Sunday morning, I immediately knew something was wrong. There were cars everywhere. Not one or two. Enough cars that I thought maybe I had missed some event announcement. Then I saw people carrying boxes through the front door. Someone was setting up folding chairs. A man was drilling a wooden sign into the cedar siding. My cedar siding. I sat in my truck for a moment, trying to understand what I was looking at. Maybe I had the wrong property. Maybe the county had made some mistake. Then I saw the old pine tree beside the porch. The same tree where my father carved a small mark when I was 10 years old. I knew exactly where I was. The problem was that everyone else seemed to think they knew too. I stepped out of my truck and a woman in a navy blazer immediately walked toward me. She had the kind of confidence you see in people who are used to being listened to. "Good morning," she said. "Can I help you?" I pointed toward the lodge. "Actually, I was hoping you could tell me what is happening here." She smiled. "I'm Victoria Caldwell, president of Pine Ridge HOA. I introduced myself. Nathan Holloway." Her expression changed slightly when she heard my name. Not fear. Not surprise. More like she was confirming something. "Well, Nathan," she said, "I think there has been a misunderstanding." I looked at the building behind her. "I own this property." She nodded politely. "I understand why you might think that." That sentence bothered me immediately. Not because she disagreed. Because she said it like I was the one who needed correcting. "I closed on the lodge 4 days ago," I said. "The county recorded the deed." I reached into my folder and pulled out the certified copy. Victoria glanced at it for less than a second. Then she looked back at me. She never asked to read it. Never asked for the parcel number. Never asked who handled the closing. She simply said, "The lodge has always belonged to Pine Ridge." Always. My father used to tell me to pay attention when people used words like always and never. He said those words usually appeared when someone was trying to make an argument sound stronger than it actually was. Behind Victoria, the man with the drill stepped away from the wall. The new sign was finished. Pine Ridge Homeowners Association. Someone inside started a coffee machine. A few people laughed near the reception desk they had installed. They weren't acting like visitors. They were acting like they had moved in. Victoria noticed me looking around. If you have concerns, you can bring them to our next board meeting. I almost laughed. Instead, I asked the only question that mattered. Can I get inside? Her smile didn't change. I'm afraid not. The locks were changed yesterday. She said it casually, like she was telling me the weather forecast. That was the moment I stopped thinking this was a misunderstanding. Someone had changed the locks on my building. Someone had moved into my lodge. And somehow, they were acting like I was the person who had arrived unexpectedly. I could have argued. I could have raised my voice. I could have called the sheriff right there. But I remembered my father's advice. Never waste your best argument on someone who has already decided they are right. So I put the deed back in my folder, walked to my truck, and started the engine. Victoria probably thought I was leaving because I had accepted her answer. She was wrong. I wasn't driving home. I was driving to the county recorder's office. Because there was one thing I couldn't stop thinking about. Victoria didn't ask to see my deed. Not even once. She acted like she already knew what it said. And I needed to find out why. The county recorder's office was 15 minutes away from the lodge, but that drive felt much longer. I kept replaying the conversation with Victoria in my head. Not the words she said. The things she didn't say. If someone walked into your building and claimed they owned it, most people would ask questions. They would ask for paperwork. They would want to see proof. Victoria did none of that. She didn't look confused. She didn't look surprised. She looked prepared. The county building was an old brick structure near the center of town. It wasn't impressive. No marble floors. No fancy signs. Just a place where people went to fix problems they wished they never had. I walked inside and headed to the front counter. The woman behind the desk looked up from her computer. Can I help you? I placed my deed on the counter. I hope so. She smiled politely. That usually means there is a story. I bought a property. Okay. The homeowners association says I didn't. Her expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough for me to know she understood this was not a normal question. What property? I told her the parcel number. She typed it into the system. For a few seconds, she said nothing. Then she called another employee over. Can you look at this? The second clerk leaned closer to the screen. They exchanged a quick glance. That was when I realized something. They weren't confused. They were interested. The older clerk walked into the back room and returned with a large property map. He unfolded it across the counter. This is the parcel. His finger moved across the map. The lodge is here. He tapped the center of the property. And this entire area transferred to you. I asked the question I already knew I needed to ask. There is no separate ownership for the building? He shook his head. No. No lease. No. No HOA agreement giving them occupancy rights. He checked the records again. No. He looked at me. Who told you they owned it? The president of Pine Ridge HOA. He leaned back slightly. That's going to be a difficult conversation for someone. I wished I believed him. But at that moment, I wasn't thinking about winning anything. I was trying to understand how 20 people could walk into a building, change the locks, and genuinely act like they had the right to do it. Before I left, I asked one more question. Was the HOA notified when ownership changed? The clerk checked another file. They should have been. Why? Because they are the neighboring association. He looked through the records. Actually, yes. A courtesy notification was sent. That stopped me. The day your deed was recorded. So they knew. I thanked him and walked back to my truck. Before I reached the door, my phone rang. It was Denise from Mountain West Title. Nathan, I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. Honestly, I don't think this week can get much stranger. She laughed quietly. I reviewed your closing file again. Why? Because something about your situation bothered me. I leaned against my truck. What did you find? We sent Pine Ridge HOA a notification before closing was finalized. I already knew the answer, but I asked anyway. They received it. Yes. How do you know? Our system records delivery and opening times. I looked back toward the county building. Someone opened it. Yes. She paused. The notification was opened 4 days ago at 9:23 in the morning. I checked the time in my head. That was almost exactly when my deed had been recorded. So someone at the HOA knew. Someone did. That was the part one couldn't get past. If Victoria truly believed the lodge belonged to the HOA, maybe she was wrong. Maybe she misunderstood something. But if someone had already told them ownership had changed, then this wasn't just confusion. Someone had information. They simply decided to ignore it. After I hung up with Denise, I drove across town to the only locksmith in the area. I still had my original keys. I wanted to know if they could simply be reprogrammed or replaced. The shop was small. A bell above the door rang when I walked in. An older man behind the counter looked up. "What can I do for you?" I placed my key on the counter. This stopped working. He picked it up and looked at it. Then he looked back at me. "Forest Lodge." I froze. "You know it." He nodded. "I changed every lock there last week." For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then he reached below the counter and pulled out a clipboard. "I think I know who you are." He flipped through the pages. "Nathan Holloway." My name was printed on the work order. I stared at the paper. "Why is my name on that?" The locksmith looked confused. "Because the property owner was listed." He turned the page toward me. "Customer, Pine Ridge Homeowners Association. Property owner, Nathan Holloway." I read it twice. Then I looked at him. "Who hired you?" "Victoria Caldwell." He sighed. "She told me the association was managing the property." "Did you ask if she had permission?" "I asked if everything was approved." "What did she say?" He hesitated. "She said the paperwork was handled." I believed him. That was the strange part. He didn't look like someone who had done something wrong. He looked like someone who had been given a story and had no reason to doubt it. He opened another folder. "I keep copies of every authorization." He handed me the document. Victoria's signature was at the bottom. Clean. Confident. Like she had signed it without a second thought. If I had known there was another owner involved, he said, I would have stopped. "I understand." And I did. Because the locksmith wasn't the person who bothered me. The person who bothered me was the one who knew exactly what was happening and still moved forward. I sat in my truck afterward with the documents spread across the passenger seat. The deed. The county records. The title notification. The locksmith paperwork. Every piece pointed in the same direction. The HOA knew someone owned the lodge. The HOA knew who that person was. And someone still decided they were going to act like the ownership record didn't matter. That was the moment I stopped asking whether Victoria had made a mistake. I started asking a different question. How many people knew the truth before I ever arrived? The first thing Grace Bennett did when I walked into her office was hand me a cup of coffee. The second thing she did was tell me I looked exhausted. I didn't argue. She was right. Her office was not what I expected from an attorney. It wasn't a large downtown building with glass walls and a receptionist waiting behind a desk. It was a small room above an old hardware store on Main Street. The floor made noise every time someone walked across it. There were stacks of files on one side of the room, a bookshelf full of old legal books on the other, and a golden retriever sleeping in the hallway like he owned the place. I stepped around him carefully. Grace looked over from her desk. "Don't worry. He only moves when there is food involved." The dog opened one eye, decided I wasn't interesting, and went back to sleep. It was the first normal moment I'd had all week. I sat down across from Grace and placed the documents on her desk. "I need help." She looked at the papers. "That usually means something went wrong." "I bought a lodge." "Okay." "The HOA changed the locks." She stopped. "On your lodge?" "Yes." She looked at me for a second. That's a sentence I don't hear every day. I told her everything. The auction. The closing. Victoria. The new sign. The people moving furniture inside. The locksmith. The title company notification. Grace didn't interrupt much. She just asked questions. Specific questions. What exact words did Victoria use? Did she say the HOA owned the land or the building? Did she ever ask to see your deed? That last question made me pause. No. Grace looked up. Not once. Not once. She made a small note. Interesting. I had learned by then that when lawyers say interesting, it usually means they have noticed something you haven't. She spread the documents across the table. She didn't organize them immediately. She just looked at them, like she was trying to understand the story before deciding where the evidence belonged. After a few minutes, she picked up the locksmith authorization. This is the part one finds strange. I leaned forward. The locks. No. She tapped the signature line. This. I looked down. Victoria's signature? The title. Authorized representative. I shrugged. What about it? Grace looked at me. If she truly believed the HOA owned the lodge, why didn't she sign as the owner? I didn't have an answer. People choose words carefully when they sign documents, she said. Sometimes more carefully than when they speak. She placed the paper back on the desk. It doesn't prove everything. But but it tells us Victoria may have understood the difference between authority and ownership. That sentence stayed with me, because that was exactly what had bothered me from the beginning. She wasn't acting confused. She was acting like someone who believed confidence could replace paperwork. The next morning, Grace and I went to the county archives. The building looked almost identical to the day before. Same front desk, same old computers, same clerk who recognized me immediately. He looked at Grace and smiled. Another complicated one. Grace smiled back. We're hoping for a simple one. He laughed. Nobody comes in here with a lawyer because things are simple. We started searching through old records. Most of them didn't help. Tax documents, maintenance permits, survey maps. Grace moved through them quickly. She wasn't frustrated when something didn't matter. She simply moved on. After nearly an hour, I finally asked, "Do you ever worry we are looking in the wrong place?" She didn't pretend otherwise. Sometimes. That surprised me. Really? She nodded. The mistake people make is thinking every investigation starts with the answer. She closed one file. Most start with finding the right question. A few minutes later, she stopped. Wait. She pulled out a thin folder. Across the top was a title, Maintenance Cooperation Agreement. I immediately felt uneasy. Is that bad? I don't know yet. We read through it together. The agreement allowed Pine Ridge HOA volunteers to help maintain trails, organize community events, and assist with landscaping around the property. Nothing about ownership. Nothing about controlling the building. Nothing about moving offices inside. Grace turned the page. Then she frowned. Something is missing. What? She held the document up. At the bottom of the page it said, page 2 of 3. Someone filed this without the final page. The county clerk searched the archive system. A few minutes later he returned with another folder. I think I found what you were looking for. Grace opened the page and started reading. This time she didn't say anything right away. She read it slowly. Then she handed it to me. The final paragraph was clear. This agreement grants no ownership, leasehold, tenancy, or exclusive occupancy rights to Pine Ridge Homeowners Association. I read it twice. So they knew. Grace didn't answer immediately. We know someone created this agreement. We know the agreement says that. But we still need to know whether Victoria saw this page. Before I could respond, the clerk cleared his throat. Actually, we looked over. A few months ago, someone from Pine Ridge requested a copy of this agreement. Grace turned. The whole agreement. He shook his head. No, only the first 2 pages. The room became quiet. Not because we had everything solved. We didn't. But because the situation had changed. Missing information was one thing. Selectively missing information was another. Grace carefully placed the document into her folder. We need to find out who requested those copies. As we walked back to her office, my phone buzzed. It was a notification from Pine Ridge HOA. A public announcement. Grand opening this Saturday. The post showed volunteers decorating the lodge. Tables set up inside. Coffee stations. A crowd standing in the lobby. Then I saw Victoria. She was standing beneath the new HOA sign, smiling for the camera. She looked completely comfortable. Grace glanced at the photo. She doesn't look worried. No. That tells me something. What? Grace handed the phone back. Either she believes she is right. She paused. Or she believes nobody will challenge her. I looked back at the picture. For the first time, I wasn't wondering whether this was a misunderstanding. I was wondering how far Victoria was willing to take it. Grace did not say much on the drive back to her office. That usually meant she was thinking. I had started noticing that about her. When she was talking, she was explaining. When she was quiet, she was usually connecting things. Finally, I asked, "You think?" Victoria knew. Grace kept her eyes on the road. I think Victoria knows more than she is saying. That's different. It is. She turned onto Main Street. Knowing someone is hiding something and proving what they are hiding are 2 different problems. I looked out the window at the town passing by. So what do we do? Grace smiled slightly. We stopped looking at the paperwork. I thought lawyers loved paperwork. We do. She glanced at me. But paperwork tells you what happened. People tell you why. That answer surprised me. After spending days looking at documents, I had started believing the solution would be hidden somewhere in a file. Grace was reminding me that every document came from a person. Every decision came from somewhere. Someone had wanted the lodge. Someone had made a choice. We just needed to understand why. The next morning, we went back to the county administration building. Not because we needed another document. Because we wanted to talk to someone who remembered what happened before I ever showed up. The records clerk recognized us immediately. Back again, he asked. Grace smiled. I promise this is the last time today. He laughed. Nobody who says that means it. She placed a copy of the maintenance agreement on the counter. Do you remember when Pine Ridge HOA first became interested in the lodge? The clerk leaned back. That was years ago. How many? About 8. What happened? He thought for a moment. They wanted to buy it. I looked at Grace. The HOA tried to purchase the lodge? The clerk nodded. Yes. And? The county said no. Why? The property wasn't being sold directly to them. It had to go through the public process. Grace wrote that down. Did Victoria Caldwell attend those discussions? The clerk looked toward the ceiling. I don't remember the name. Then he smiled. But I remember the person. How? Because she kept arguing after everyone else accepted the answer. He opened an old drawer and searched through some notes. There were several people from Pine Ridge there. What did they want? They believed the lodge belonged with the community. Meaning? He shrugged. They had been using parts of the property for events and volunteer activities. They felt connected to it. But they didn't own it. Correct. Grace nodded. Did anyone explain that clearly? Several times. The clerk leaned forward. The county was very clear. He paused. That was the strange part. What? Nobody misunderstood the answer. They just didn't like it. That sentence stayed with me. There was a difference between being confused and refusing to accept something. The clerk searched through another file. Actually, I might have something. He pulled out old county meeting notes. The paper looked like it had been sitting there for years. He opened the folder. Here. The heading read, Future of Forest Lodge Property. Grace read silently. Then she handed it to me. The notes were from a public meeting 8 years earlier. The county had denied the HOA's request to purchase the lodge. The reason was simple. The property would only be transferred through the required public auction process. There was no promise, no agreement, no hidden ownership, just a decision. Who was at this meeting? Grace asked. The clerk looked through the attendance list. Several HOA representatives. He pointed to one name. Victoria Caldwell. I looked at the page. There it was. 8 years earlier. Same person. Same property. Different circumstances. What happened after the decision? Grace asked. The clerk thought for a moment. Most people left. Victoria? He smiled slightly. She stayed. Why? She wanted to talk more. About what? The clerk tapped the notes. About the idea that ownership was just a technical issue. Grace looked up. A technical issue? That was the phrase she used. My stomach tightened. Not because it was shocking. Because it sounded familiar. The same idea I had heard outside the lodge. The same confidence. The same belief that paperwork was somehow less important than intention. On the way back, Grace was quiet again. This time I understood why. We drove past the lodge. The parking lot was full. A local news van was parked near the entrance. Victoria stood outside speaking with a reporter. Grace slowed down. Do not get out. I wasn't planning to. We watched from across the road. The reporter raised a microphone. So this is the new Pine Ridge headquarters? Victoria smiled. Yes. How long has this been planned? Victoria looked directly at the camera. For years. I reached for my phone and started recording. The reporter continued. Was it difficult to make this happen? Victoria laughed softly. Good things take time. Grace watched the screen. She wasn't angry. She wasn't surprised. She was studying. The interview lasted less than 5 minutes. Victoria never mentioned the auction. Never mentioned the deed. Never mentioned me. When it ended, Grace handed my phone back. She is very comfortable telling that story. What does that mean? It means she has been telling it for a long time. Before we could leave, an old green pickup pulled beside us. The driver rolled down the window. Nathan Holloway? I looked over. Yes. My name is Harold Mercer. He looked toward the lodge. I used to be on the HOA board. Grace introduced herself. Harold nodded. I know who you are. Then he looked back at me. I've been hoping we would talk. Why? He glanced at the building where Victoria was still giving interviews. Because she is telling everyone the ending. What ending? Harold reached behind the seat of his truck and pulled out an old cardboard box. The one where Pine Ridge owns the lodge. He placed the box on the passenger seat. The problem is. He looked at me. I remember the beginning. Grace looked at the box. What's inside? Harold smiled. Everything I saved when I left the board. Meeting minutes. Emails. Old notices. He tapped the lid. My wife told me to throw it all away. I didn't listen. I laughed quietly. Harold looked back toward the lodge. After seeing that interview, I think I know why I kept it. Grace picked up the box. It was heavier than it looked. Harold, yes. I think you might have just brought us the part of the story Victoria hoped everyone forgot. Harold's box looked like something most people would have thrown away years ago. The cardboard was soft around the corners. The tape had turned yellow. There were old labels stuck on top of older labels, and one side had a coffee stain that looked almost permanent. But when Harold placed it on Grace's desk, he handled it carefully, like it wasn't a box of papers, like it was a piece of history. My wife hated this thing, Harold said. She said nobody needed 10 years of HOA paperwork sitting in the garage. Grace smiled. And you disagreed? Harold nodded. I told her someday someone would need to know what actually happened. He looked at me. I just didn't know that someone would be you. We spent the next several hours going through the contents. At first, it was exactly what you would expect from an HOA archive. Budgets, landscaping contracts, meeting schedules, expense reports. There were even 3 pages of discussion about replacing the entrance sign. I looked at Harold. 3 pages. He shrugged. People have strong opinions about signs. Grace laughed. I am learning more about HOA meetings than I ever wanted to know. Harold pointed at a folder. Wait until you find the mailbox argument. There was a mailbox argument? 2 meetings. 2. They almost formed a committee. For the first time in days, the situation felt normal. Not because anything had been solved, but because these were real people. Real neighbors. Not just names on documents. As we continued searching, Harold explained who people were. He remembered the ones who asked too many questions. The ones who never showed up. The ones who always wanted to control every detail. It gave the old meeting records a human side. They weren't just pages anymore. They were moments when people made choices. After nearly an hour, Grace opened a faded blue binder and stopped. What is it? I asked. She didn't answer immediately. She looked at Harold. Do you remember the meeting where the county decision was discussed? Harold's expression changed. Yes. This one. She turned the binder around. The cover read, Board Meeting Minutes. 8 years earlier. Agenda item, Forest Lodge property. Harold sat down slowly. I was hoping we wouldn't find that. Why? I asked. He looked at the binder. Because that's the meeting where I should have spoken louder. Grace opened the pages carefully. The notes were short. Almost too short. But the meaning was clear. The HOA had discussed purchasing the lodge. The county had explained the process. The board was informed that Pine Ridge had no ownership rights. Harold pointed to a paragraph near the bottom. There. Grace read it. Then she looked at me. The county told them directly. I felt my stomach tighten. Told who? The entire board. Harold nodded. Everyone present heard it. Including Victoria? Harold sighed. Especially Victoria. He leaned back. She didn't like the answer. What did she say? Harold looked down at the table. I remember because everyone stopped talking. He took a breath. She said the county was looking at the situation too narrowly. She said the community had invested years into maintaining that place. Grace asked, did anyone challenge her? Harold gave a small smile. One person did. Who? An older man named Frank. He was on the board longer than anyone. Harold looked at the old minutes. He asked her a simple question. What question? Harold repeated it. If the lodge already belonged to us, why were we asking permission to buy it? Nobody spoke for a moment. What did Victoria say? I asked. Harold shook his head. Nothing. She moved the conversation to another topic. Grace nodded slowly. That answer tells you a lot. Why? Because sometimes the response to a question tells you more than the answer. Harold opened another folder. Inside were old newsletters and campaign materials. One paper caught his attention. There it is. He pulled it out. It was a flyer from the year Victoria ran for HOA president. The front showed a picture of the lodge. Below it were the words, a permanent home for Pine Ridge HOA. I looked at Harold. Did people know what she meant? He shook his head. Not really. We thought she meant buying land someday. Building something. Creating a community center. Nobody thought she meant moving into a property that wasn't ours. Grace carefully placed the flyer into a folder. That distinction matters. Before I could respond, my phone rang. It was Denise from Mountain West Title. I answered. Nathan, sorry to bother you again. You have a habit of calling when things get more complicated. She laughed. I was reviewing the notification records. Grace immediately looked up. I put the phone on speaker. What did you find? Denise took a breath. The ownership notice was opened by someone at Pine Ridge. We already knew that. Yes, but I found something else. What? The email was forwarded. The room became quiet. Harold leaned forward. Forwarded to who? I cannot see the exact person because of privacy settings, but I can confirm it went to another HOA board email address. Grace picked up her pen. So at least 2 people knew. Correct. Denise paused. And the timing matters. Why? The email was opened at 9:23 in the morning. The forward happened at 9:31. 8 minutes. Nobody said anything. Because 8 minutes changed the story. A person who accidentally missed information might need days to understand what happened. 8 minutes was different. Someone saw the notice. Someone read it. Someone decided another person needed to see it. After the call ended, Grace stood and walked to her whiteboard. She erased the timeline we had been building all week. Then she wrote 3 words. No, Ed. She stopped, looked at it, then erased it and started again. Finally, she wrote, someone new. What are you thinking? I asked. Grace put the marker down. At first, I thought we were dealing with one person who made a bad decision. She looked at Harold. Now I think we are dealing with a group of people who decided not to ask questions. Harold looked down at the old meeting minutes. That might be worse. Grace nodded. It usually is. She gathered the documents into a folder. Tomorrow, we stop looking for proof that the HOA was wrong. What do we look for? She looked at me. Proof that they knew they were wrong. Grace was right about one thing. Finding out someone knew the truth was easier than finding out why they ignored it. The next morning, we stopped looking at documents and started looking at people. That was something I hadn't expected. I thought the answer would be hidden in a file somewhere. A signature, a sentence, a line of text that would finally explain everything. But the more we learned, the more I realized this wasn't just about paperwork. It was about decisions. Real people had looked at the situation, heard the facts, and decided to move forward anyway. Grace spent most of the morning making phone calls. She didn't tell anyone what we had found. She didn't accuse anyone. She simply asked questions. Small questions. The kind that gave people room to answer honestly. Around noon, she finally put her phone down and leaned back in her chair. I think we are missing someone. I looked up from the documents. Who? The person who knew enough to stop this. I waited. And didn't. Grace nodded. Exactly. That answer bothered me more than I expected. Because she was right. Victoria was easy to focus on. She was the face of the HOA. She was the person standing in front of cameras. She was the one who signed the locksmith paperwork. But she wasn't the only person in that organization. Someone else had received the email. Someone else had seen the notice. Someone else had watched everything happen. So how do we find them? I asked. Grace picked up Harold's old board records. We asked who disappeared. That afternoon, Harold called us. I remembered something. When Harold said that, I had learned to pay attention. Every time he remembered something, it seemed to open another door. What is it? Grace asked. A board member. Which one? Elliot Dawson. The name was unfamiliar to me. Harold explained. He was secretary during the years when all of this started. Was he still on the board when the locks were changed? Grace asked. No. He resigned before then. Why? Harold was quiet for a moment. I never knew. Grace looked at me. Now we might. Harold knew where Elliot spent Thursday mornings. Apparently, some people in small towns had routines so predictable that everyone knew them. Elliot had breakfast at the same diner every Thursday. Same booth. Same coffee. Same newspaper. People like that are easy to find, Harold said. They don't hide. They just stay in the same place. The diner was exactly what I expected. Small. Warm. A little crowded. The kind of place where the waitress already knows what you want before you sit down. Harold was waiting near the back. Across from him sat an older man wearing a gray jacket. When he saw me walk in, his expression changed slightly. Not surprise. More like recognition. Harold stood. Nathan. Grace. This is Elliot. Elliot shook my hand. I've been wondering when this conversation would happen. We sat down. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Not because it was uncomfortable. Because everyone understood this was something that had been waiting a long time. Grace didn't start with accusations. She didn't mention the lawsuit. She simply asked, were you on the HOA board when the county discussed the lodge? Elliot nodded. Yes. Did you believe the HOA owned it? He answered immediately. No. The answer was so direct that I almost missed it. No explanation. No excuse. Just no. Grace continued. Were you present when the locks were changed? Elliot looked down at his coffee. Yes. What happened? He took a slow breath. I thought we were moving storage supplies. You didn't know the locks were being replaced? Not at first. He looked at me. When the locksmith arrived, I started feeling uncomfortable. Why? Because he kept asking normal questions. What kind of questions? Elliot looked toward the window. Who was the owner? Where should the spare keys go? Who approved the work? Grace nodded. And what did Victoria say? Elliot answered quietly. She said the paperwork had already been handled. I already knew that phrase. It was the same explanation the locksmith had received. The same vague answer that avoided the real question. Did you believe her? I asked. Elliot gave a small, tired smile. For about 5 minutes. Then what changed? The locksmith asked where he should deliver the extra keys. He paused. Victoria said there wasn't another owner. Nobody spoke. That was the moment I knew something was wrong. I looked at him. Then why didn't you stop it? It was a simple question, but it carried everything I had been wondering. Elliot didn't get defensive. He didn't look away. Because I should have. That answer surprised me. I thought maybe I didn't know everything. I thought maybe Victoria had information I didn't have. And honestly, he looked down. I didn't want to fight. Harold nodded quietly. A lot of people make that mistake. Elliot looked at him. They think staying quiet keeps things calm. But sometimes it just lets things continue. Grace finally opened her notebook. Elliot, if this goes to court, would you testify? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached inside his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I found something after I left the board. He placed it on the table. I almost threw it away. Grace unfolded it carefully. It was an email. From Victoria Caldwell. Sent to HOA board members. Subject, Forest Lodge Strategy. Grace read the first few lines. Then she stopped. Her expression changed. Not excitement. Not surprise. Something more serious. She turned the paper toward me. One paragraph had been highlighted. Once someone eventually purchases the property, we will address ownership questions if they arise. Until then, there is no reason to change how we have been operating. I read it slowly. The words were simple. Too simple. There was no confusion in them. No misunderstanding. Elliot looked at the paper. I kept telling myself she didn't mean it the way it sounded. Grace folded the email. And now? He sighed. Now I think I knew exactly what it meant. On the drive back, nobody talked much. We had spent days looking for the moment where everything changed. The moment when someone crossed the line between mistake and choice. I think we finally found it. Grace placed the email in the evidence folder. This changes things. I looked over. Because it proves she knew? Partly. Then what? Grace looked out the window. Because it shows this wasn't an accident. It was a decision. Grace filed the lawsuit the next morning. I expected more ceremony. Maybe a dramatic moment where she placed a stack of papers on a desk and announced that we were ready. Instead, she sat at her computer, uploaded the documents, clicked a button, and leaned back in her chair. That's it? I asked. She looked over. That's it. I thought there would be more. More what? I searched for the right word. More legal drama. She smiled. Most legal drama happens in email threads and calendar reminders. I laughed. That is much less exciting. It is also much more expensive. The complaint was not as long as I expected. Grace had explained earlier that strong cases were not built by throwing every possible document at a judge. They were built by showing the important facts clearly. She included the recorded deed, the county records, the maintenance agreement, the locksmith authorization, the title notification, the board minutes, and finally, Elliot's email. The message Victoria had written years earlier. The one that changed everything. When I asked why she left out some of the other documents, Grace gave me an answer I remembered. Judges don't need more paper. They need a clear story. That was exactly what we had. A simple story. I bought a property. The HOA knew I bought it. They changed the locks anyway. The only question left was whether anyone was willing to admit it. By that afternoon, the HOA had been officially served. Grace sent me a short message. They have notice. I stared at those 3 words longer than I expected. After everything that happened, I thought I would feel relieved. Instead, I felt strangely calm. For days, I had been searching, calling people, looking through records, trying to understand what had happened. Now there was nothing left to investigate. The next move belonged to someone else. That feeling lasted about 3 hours. Then Harold called. Are you sitting down? I was standing in my kitchen. I can sit. Good idea. I pulled out a chair. What happened? Emergency HOA meeting. Already. 20 minutes after they received the lawsuit. That caught my attention. What are they doing? I don't know exactly. Harold paused. But I have never seen people move that quickly unless something is wrong. Later that afternoon, Harold called again. This time he sounded amused. You were right. About what? Something was wrong. What happened? They are clearing out the lodge. I stood up. They are leaving? Looks like it. How can you tell? Harold laughed. Because they packed the coffee maker. Nobody removes a coffee maker unless they are preparing to leave. I smiled despite myself. That was the first time in days that the situation felt almost normal. We drove past the lodge that evening. The difference was obvious. The balloons were gone. The folding tables had disappeared. The lobby looked less like a community center and more like an empty office after a move. 2 volunteers were carefully removing the HOA sign from the front of the building. They were not angry. They were not arguing. They were simply packing. Grace watched quietly from the passenger seat. Interesting. What? They are leaving voluntarily before the hearing. Is that good for us? It depends. On what? She pointed toward the building. On what they say happened. I looked at her. Explain. If they tell the court they never really occupied the property, then those photos and videos become very important. I remembered Victoria standing beneath the HOA sign. The interview. The grand opening. The decorations. The confidence. Suddenly, I understood why Grace had kept telling me to document everything. Evidence was not always a document. Sometimes it was a moment someone created themselves. As we watched, a silver sedan pulled into the parking lot. A man stepped out carrying a leather briefcase. He walked directly toward Victoria. They spoke for a few minutes. Even from across the road, I could tell the conversation was serious. Their attorney? I asked. Grace nodded. Probably. How do you know? Because nobody else carries that much paper while looking that worried. The next morning, Grace received a call. She looked at the number and smiled slightly. Opposing counsel. She answered. Grace Bennett. I could only hear her side of the conversation. She listened for a while, then replied. I understand your position. Another pause. No, my client is not interested in pretending ownership is unclear. She looked at me. Yes. We are willing to discuss resolution. A few minutes later, she ended the call. They want to settle. Already. She nodded. They are testing whether we are willing to compromise. Are we? Grace closed the file. We are willing to be reasonable. What does that mean? It means my client gets his property back first. Then we talk about everything else. The following morning, another notification arrived from the court. The judge had reviewed the filings. A hearing was scheduled for Tuesday morning. I looked at the date. 4 days away. Is that normal? I asked Grace. She shook her head. Not usually. Why did it happen so quickly? She looked at the documents on her desk. Because the ownership question appears straightforward, and the judge wants to address it quickly. I read the notice again. A week earlier, I was planning repairs and wondering whether I had made the right decision buying an old lodge in the mountains. Now I was preparing to stand in court against an entire homeowners association. The strange part was that I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even surprised. I finally understood something. This was never about whether I owned the lodge. The records had answered that question before I ever arrived. The real question was whether people who had spent years believing a story would accept what happened when the facts finally caught up with them. And on Tuesday morning, we were going to find out. The courthouse was quieter than I expected. I think that surprised me more than anything. After everything that had happened, I imagined a courtroom would feel different. More serious. More dramatic. Maybe something like the movies. But the reality was much simpler. People walked through the hallway carrying folders. Someone was asking where to pay a fine. A man near the entrance was trying to find the right room. Everyone had their own problem, their own story, and for most of them, it was just another Tuesday morning. Grace met me outside the courtroom carrying a single folder. Not a box, not a stack of binders, just one folder. I looked at it and smiled. That's all. She nodded. That's all. After everything we collected? Most of it helped us understand the story. She opened the folder. The judge only needs the parts that prove it. That was one thing I had learned from Grace. She never tried to make a situation look bigger than it was. She didn't need to. The facts were enough. Inside the courtroom, Victoria was already there. She sat at the table with the HOA attorney and 2 board members. She looked the same as always. Navy blazer, calm expression, perfect posture. But something was different. The confidence she had outside the lodge was gone. She wasn't greeting people. She wasn't giving instructions. She was quietly reading documents. Her attorney looked even less comfortable. He kept reviewing notes, crossing things out, then writing new ones. Grace noticed. He's changing his argument. How can you tell? Because he keeps removing things. I looked over. Is that normal? She smiled slightly. It usually means someone realized the first version won't work. A few minutes later, the clerk called our case. Everyone stood. The judge entered, took his seat, and immediately began reviewing the file. He didn't make a speech. He didn't ask anyone to explain the background. He had already read everything. That alone made me feel different. This wasn't about convincing someone who knew nothing. This was about answering questions from someone who had already seen the evidence. The judge looked up. Mr. Holloway is requesting immediate possession of the property. Grace stood. Yes, Your Honor. The judge looked toward the defense table. And the association does not dispute the recorded deed. The HOA attorney stood. No, Your Honor. That sentence caught my attention. They weren't arguing that I own the lodge. They were arguing something else. The judge looked back at Grace. Proceed. Grace didn't waste time. She walked through the timeline. The purchase. The recorded deed. The notification sent to Pine Ridge. The locksmith authorization. The maintenance agreement. The board records. Elliot's email. She never raised her voice. She never accused anyone of lying. She simply showed what happened. When she finished, she sat down. The HOA attorney stood. Your Honor, the association acknowledges the ownership issue. However, we believe there was a good faith misunderstanding regarding the association's ability to continue using the property. The judge looked at him. A misunderstanding. Yes, Your Honor. Even though the association was notified of the ownership transfer. Yes. Even though the maintenance agreement states there are no occupancy rights. The attorney paused. Yes. Even though the board had previously discussed the county's decision regarding ownership. Another pause. Yes. The judge looked down at the file. That is a considerable amount of misunderstanding. Nobody said anything. Then the judge turned toward Victoria. Ms. Caldwell. She stood. Yes, Your Honor. I have some questions. Her expression remained controlled. Of course. Were you aware the county had denied Pine Ridge HOA's attempt to purchase this property several years ago? Yes. Were you aware the agreement between the county and Pine Ridge did not grant ownership or exclusive occupancy rights? Yes. Were you aware Mr. Holloway purchased the property before the locks were changed? Victoria hesitated. Yes. The judge looked at the documents in front of him. Then help me understand something. He paused. Why were the locks changed? Victoria looked toward her attorney. He remained silent. Finally, she answered. Because the association believed it had the right to continue operating there. The judge nodded slowly. I understand that was the belief. He looked at the file again. But belief alone does not create ownership. That sentence seemed to change the room. Not because it was surprising. Because it was simple. Everyone had spent weeks talking about history. About community. About intentions. The judge brought it back to the one thing that mattered. Rights came from law, not assumption. The HOA attorney looked down at his notes. He did not call witnesses. He did not present new evidence. He simply said, "No further questions, Your Honor." Grace leaned toward me. That usually tells you everything. I watched the judge review the documents one more time. Then he reached for the order. The court finds that Mr. Holloway's ownership of the property is clear. He continued, the association shall surrender possession immediately. Any remaining claims regarding damages will be addressed separately. He signed the order. The entire hearing took less than an hour. No shouting. No dramatic confrontation. Just facts being placed in front of someone whose job was to separate facts from assumptions. Outside the courtroom, Victoria walked past us without saying anything. One of the board members stopped briefly. He looked uncomfortable. I should have asked more questions. I nodded. Most people should. He looked back toward the courtroom. We trusted the wrong information. Sometimes that happens. He nodded and walked away. That afternoon, we returned to the lodge. A deputy sheriff met us there along with the locksmith. The same man who had changed the locks days earlier. He looked at me and smiled awkwardly. I was hoping our next meeting would be under better circumstances. So was I. The deputy reviewed the court order, then handed it to him. Go ahead. The locksmith replaced the locks. The HOA sign came down. The tables disappeared. The boxes were carried out. Nobody argued. Nobody made a speech. They simply left. As the final vehicle disappeared down the mountain road, I I stood outside the lodge and listened. The creek, the wind, the trees, the sounds I remembered from childhood. Grace stood beside me. "You know what is interesting?" she said. I looked over. "What?" "They spent years trying to convince everyone this place belonged to them." She looked toward the empty parking lot. "And today, they had to accept the one thing they never wanted to hear." "What was that?" She smiled slightly. "It was never theirs to begin with." I unlocked the front door. The key turned smoothly. And for the first time since buying the lodge, I stepped inside without wondering who would tell me I couldn't. For the first time in weeks, I woke up and didn't check my phone before getting out of bed. That might sound like a small thing, but after everything that happened, it felt like a victory. For days, every notification could have been another problem, another message, another question, another reminder that someone had decided my property belonged to them. That morning was different. The lodge was quiet, the kind of quiet I remembered from when I was a kid. I made coffee, walked onto the porch, and sat down with the same view my father and I used to enjoy. The mountains hadn't changed. The trees hadn't changed. The creek still sounded exactly the same. Somehow, after all the paperwork, meetings, and court appearances, the thing I fought hardest to protect was the one thing that had been there the entire time. The feeling of being home. The weeks after the hearing were not dramatic. Honestly, I was grateful for that. Real life rarely works like a movie where everything gets fixed in one perfect moment. There were repairs to make, things to organize, a lot of cleaning. But those were good problems. They were my problems. Harold was the first person to show up with supplies. He arrived in his old pickup truck carrying tools, coffee, and enough breakfast pastries for a small group. "I figured you would need help," he said. I looked at the truck bed. "Did you bring your entire garage?" He smiled. "You never know." That was Harold. He had a way of making even stressful situations feel normal. A few minutes later, Elliot arrived. At first, he stood near the driveway like he wasn't sure whether he belonged there. I understood why. He had carried a lot of regret since the day we met. But Harold immediately handed him a toolbox. Good timing. Elliot looked confused. "For what?" Harold pointed toward the porch. "That loose board." Elliot laughed quietly. "You are not going to let me avoid this, are you?" "No." "Good." And just like that, the awkwardness disappeared. We spent the day putting the lodge back together. The HOA furniture came out. The temporary office setup disappeared. The signs were removed. The rooms slowly started looking like the place I remembered. Not a headquarters. Not a meeting space. Just a mountain lodge again. One of the volunteers had left behind several flower pots near the entrance. Harold looked at them and shrugged. "These can stay." I looked at him. "Really? Why not?" He smiled. "The flowers didn't do anything wrong." That stayed with me. Not everything connected to a bad situation had to become part of the conflict. Sometimes you could simply move forward. A few weeks later, the final part of the legal process ended. The HOA agreed to cover the costs connected to the unauthorized changes, including repairs and my legal expenses. Grace called me with the update. "It's finished." I leaned back in my chair. That's it. That's it. I thought you would sound happier." She laughed. "I am. You don't sound like it. I am an attorney. We have a professional obligation to sound tired." I laughed. "So this is your victory celebration?" "Absolutely. Coffee and paperwork." "Exactly." That was Grace. Even after everything, she never acted like she had won some great battle. She just did her job. She found the facts. She followed the process. She let the law do what it was supposed to do. A month later, Harold stopped by with the latest news. The HOA had elected a new board president. "Different style," Harold said. "Better?" I asked. He smiled. The first thing he said at the meeting was that everyone needed to read the documents before making decisions. I laughed. That sounds like a good rule. A very expensive lesson. Winter arrived early that year. The first snow covered the mountains just before Thanksgiving. One afternoon, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched the snow settle on the trees. I thought about everything that had happened. The strange thing was, I never hated the people involved. I was frustrated. I was tired. I was disappointed. But I never wanted revenge. I just wanted the truth to matter. And in the end, that was what happened. People sometimes ask me if I regret buying the lodge. They usually ask after hearing the whole story. They hear about the HOA, the court, the stress, the weeks of uncertainty. Then they ask, knowing everything now, would you still buy it? My answer is always the same. Yes, without hesitation. Because I didn't buy the lodge because it was easy. I bought it because it meant something. I bought it because my father brought me there. I bought it because some places become part of your life long before they ever become part of your name. The lawsuit was never the reason I bought the property. It was just an unexpected chapter in the story, a chapter that reminded me of something important. Ownership is not about who speaks the loudest. It is not about who has the biggest group of supporters. It is not about who has been there the longest. It is about what is true. Today, when I unlocked the front door, I still think about that first day. The day Victoria told me there had been a misunderstanding. She was right about one thing. There was a misunderstanding. She just had the wrong person confused. The lodge was never waiting for someone to claim it. It was waiting for someone to come home.